We've got a really exciting panel with us this morning to discuss an issue on rough sleeping. Can I get our guests to firstly introduce themselves? I'll start from the front here.
Hello, I'm Alicia Walker. I'm Assistant Director of Advocacy and Activisim at Shelter. Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Carin Tunaker. I'm a lecturer in law and researcher in homelessness at Kent Law School.
Good morning, I'm Balbir Chatrik, Director of Policy and Prevention at Centrepoint.
I'm John Bird, ex-homeless, ex-rough sleeper, ex-prisoner, ex-everything, the kind of people you meet on the streets. I was one of them. I'm now out of that, and I started the big issue because I wanted to do something different to poverty rather than more of the same.
Thank you. Can I just ask my parliamentary colleagues to introduce themselves and their constituency?
Well, I'm Gary Mahindra. I'm the Conservative member of South West Hertfordshire.
Lewis Cocking, the Conservative member for Broxbourne.
Lee Dillon, the Liberal Democrat member for Newbury.
Will Forster, Liberal Democrat member for Woking.
Joe Powell, Labour member for Kensington and Bayswater.
Michelle Khan, the Labour member for Gillingham and Raynham.
Maya Ellis, Labour member for Ribble Valley.
And Chris Curtis, Labour member for Milton Keynes North.
Thank you, everyone. So we've got two panels this morning. We've got our first one until about 10:45. We're going to answer a range of questions, so please, if someone's already covered that topic, you don't need to repeat the question, and sometimes colleagues will indicate if they want a particular guest to answer a particular question. I'm going to kick off the panel and just ask, obviously, this is an issue that continues to rise and continues to have high demands. For all our guests, just as an opener, why do you think rough sleeping has been on the rise in recent years? Just to kick off. Lord Bird.
I think forgive me. I think the reason it's been on the rise is because no government has addressed the issue of rough sleeping. What they've done is they've addressed the issue of rough sleeping. So what they've done is they've worshipped at the altar of the accomplished fact, which is when somebody ends up homeless. They have not put their energies and their finances into preventing those people becoming homeless. So I come from a particular section of the British working class, which is called the London Irish working class. We were poor, we lived in the slums. There was a predictability of failure that John Anthony Joseph Bird, who sits before you, was going to end up homeless or in crime or whatever. A predictability which is playing out at the moment. And I think that all the eggs in the governmental basket has always been put on emergency, responding. And they have never put any money on prevention, and they have put no money on cure. So we're now in this situation where more and more people, and it's vectoring out into people who formerly would not have had anything to do with homelessness, but who are forming into homeless. So my opinion is the government and the last government and the next government, because they're all working, unfortunately, in the same methodology, will continue to produce the preconditions of homelessness. And until we get a government or a government department who says, let us prevent, let's turn the tap off and spend the money, I think we are always going to be treading water. That's my humble opinion.
Can I come in here? Right, I'd agree, right, prevention is really, really important. And what we're doing work in schools, Centrepoint is, and we're looking at family support. And we know that makes a difference, supporting the family. So either mediation, putting those services in place, the support they need so families can stay together. So Centrepoint works with young people. If it's safe for them to be staying at home, we would encourage them to stay at home. So that family support is critical. So that's the prevention element. And then we've got a helpline. Young people call the helpline. And really the major causes of rough sleeping with young people are the lack of temporary accommodation. That is really, really one of the big drivers. Plus also gatekeeping by local authorities.
Sorry. What do you mean by gatekeeping?
So let me give you one example. We had Jenny. She went to a local authority. She had a history of rough sleeping. She was pregnant. So she went to she called her local authority. Sometimes it's really hard to get the numbers of local authority departments right. She got the number, called them, and told them she was pregnant, and they said, "We will see you next month." This was November last year. "We'll see you in December." She's pregnant, and it was very, very cold. We then intervened on her behalf, and they said she can go to severe weather emergency centre. That is not suitable for a pregnant young woman. Normally it's a mattress on the floor, church hall, or maybe other kind of hall. That's what they referred her to. Sometimes we know young people don't even get to be assessed by the local authority. So you've got the Homelessness Reduction Act. Our research shows a third of the young people who actually approach their local authorities do not get assessed.
Okay. Shelby, you want to come in quickly?
It was just a question around, I think, the comment around prevention, which I completely take, but it was just a follow-up because obviously we have seen a significant rise, and I know Shelter's data and other data has shown that, particularly over the last decade, but certainly year on year, there has been an increase in both rough sleeping and homelessness. I just wanted to understand from the panel what you think those specific reasons behind that are in terms of prevention and how we can tackle some of those issues. Where would we start?
Could I just make the point? Sorry, I'm sorry. I shouldn't really be sitting here before you because I don't think you're doing the right thing. I think what you're doing is you're looking at the problem when it becomes a problem. You're not. Parliament is no good at looking at the Treasury is no good at preventing the problem. So I spent 33 years running the big issue, and before that campaigning in homelessness and homeless prevention, and before that being homeless myself and a rough sleeper, and 78 years of experience tell me that we're getting it wrong and we are not. So, but Balbir is what she's talking to you is anecdotal evidence of social failure. I don't hear people saying, how can we prevent this? How can we turn the tap off? And in my opinion, you will go nowhere in this world. Let me just give you one example. In 1940, when Britain was facing defeat in the World War against Hitler, there was no chance we were going to win them. Do you know what Churchill and Attlee did? They invented a committee. They dug William Beveridge out of retirement, and they made him create what became the model for the welfare state. So at a time when everything was emergency, he was commissioned to imagine the world beyond the emergency, and we are not doing it. We are full of, in my opinion, it's the mind-forged manacles of always doing with the emergency. I spent decades working on the emergency, and the reason I went into the House of Lords was one reason alone: to dismantle poverty, because I could find nobody doing anything more than trying to make the poor a bit more comfortable.
Would you welcome the new task force that the Deputy Prime Minister is going to chair? Would you welcome the new task force that the Deputy Prime Minister is going to chair, bringing together a range of
I would welcome it. I would welcome it, but I would like the Prime Minister to come and sit with me and spend maybe 4 or 5 hours or 4 or 5 days. And sorry, I have delusions of grandeur. Forgive me, because he's not going to beat his path. He's the pathway to my door. But I would love him to say, why is every government that I've had any dealings with, why are they always treading the same ground? And it's largely because they enter Parliament, they take the same shape, irrespective of the politics, of the previous government and the previous government and the previous government. So, sorry to go on, but until a committee comes along and says, let us deal with the emergency, let us fight the emergency, let us not make the young lady that you're talking about. Let us not allow her to fall between the cracks in society. But at the same time, let's do what Churchill and Attlee did, and that is create the mechanisms, the methodology for prevention and cure.
Thank you. Dr. Carin and then Alicia.
I agree with all my panellists, thank you. And I would like to add that I think one of the fundamental problems is that if somebody is rough sleeping, there is nowhere suitable for them to go. So we don't have the mechanisms in place for people with different types of social disadvantages to safely go. And this is the result of what I would call a multi-system organ failure. So we've got a combination of issues hitting from different angles. There is not enough cross-sector working happening. There's a chronic underfunding of social care. There's not enough affordable housing. There's discrimination in the private rented sector. The local housing allowance rates are not sufficient to cover rents. And on top of that, people are grappling with new things, cost of living crisis, the effects of Brexit. And what is happening in the end of this is that people, particularly people with intersecting social disadvantage, are not getting support that they need. So what we have is law, policy, and practical solutions that are not really equipped to recognise the compounding effects of multiple forms of social disadvantage, not considering the compounding nature of being LGBTQ+, of being from an ethnic minority background, having a disability, being neurodiverse, and so on. Much more needs to go into that.
Alicia.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said by my fellow panellists, but I also would like to press home that word emergency. We're in an emergency, we're in a housing emergency, and we can't normalise what that means and the depth of deprivation that goes with an emergency. And to explain that, I think I'd set it into both supply and demand. So in terms of supply, we have all felt the escalating cost of living, of existing in this country. If you put that into context, that means that rent is escalating, it means that home ownership is out of reach for many people, but also local housing allowance, it hasn't kept up with it. It's meant that a lot of people can't afford to live. Very simply, the cost of living means people can't afford to live. But on the other side, supply is a real issue. We have seen that we just do not have enough affordable social rent homes in this country. Building has not kept up with the level of supply that I have, of demand rather, that I have just set out. And therefore, until we start building and really replacing the stock that needs to be there, there's always going to be this crisis. Because to sort of pose a rhetorical question backwards, we say, why has rough sleeping escalated? But where are these people supposed to go? If the homes don't exist, if the supply is going up, where will these people go?
Can I
quickly?
Sorry, can I make a really draconian point? And that is that if you build more social housing, you will create more people who are taken off the streets and taken into places. And I agree wholeheartedly with the social housing. I moved from the racist slums of Notting Hill, where because I was Irish, I was treated as what later was treated by black people when they arrived. So we were the people, and we got into social housing. When I moved into social housing, there were police officers who lived in our block. They were retired people, they were infirm people. The social mix was incredible. Training teachers. It was sociable housing. Unfortunately, because of some really bad government decisions made by Harold Wilson, it led to the fact that there was an enormous pressure on social housing. He created something called the Rent Act of 1965, and it removed 40% of private landlords. 60% of all people in 1964 were living in private rented accommodation. The big supplier was not local authorities at the time, and there were no such things as housing associations. And it was largely because they made private landlords aware of the fact that the tenant was more important than them. So all of that led to the fact that after 1965, you removed an enormous amount of housing that was lived in by members of, working class people. That was removed. And then what happened was an enormous pressure was put on social housing, and the local authorities had to keep raising the game and up and up and up. So people like my brothers, who had been on the housing list and were at number 98 and 102, they were removed. And people in need, largely people of single mothers and all. So what you got was this enormous pressure on sociable housing, and all of the other people disappeared. Now, that to me is one of the major problems, but I do feel, in my opinion, we have to address the really unfortunate thing is that only 2 or 3% of children, of people who live in social housing, ever get to finish their levels, school leaving certificates, ever get to get a job which would earn them enough money, ever get to the university. So what you get is this weird situation. If you want to condemn somebody to 2 or 3 generations of poverty, give them social housing, until this government addresses the fact that social housing is not a precursor to social mobility and social opportunity. Everybody in this room is socially mobile. And in my opinion, let's give the poorest amongst us the social mobility that you have.
That's good. Carin, you want to come
Thank
in
you,
on
France.
funding?
My question is actually going to be aimed at Balbir and Alicia. We obviously had the recent budget, and I'm a Conservative, I don't want to get political, but there were some increases in things like national insurance and the minimum wage. How has that affected your ability to do how has that affected your organisation's ability to do their jobs?
It's early days. We've been calculating how much the cost is going to be to us and what the implications will be. But if you think about the young people that we serve, we're actually really pleased that the minimum wage has gone up for them, and we're really pleased that slowly they were brought up to the adult level as well.
Can I tell you in the big issue, the knock-on effect?
Balbir, do you mind if I ask Alicia to
sorry, forgive my trespass. Forgive me.
No, it's a really important question, and I think the answer is somewhat twofold, and I would agree with Balbir, because I think it's important as employers that we make the correct calculations before we make a proper response to that question. As employers, it's important that we're able to operate as best as we possibly can to serve the people that are so important that we're here today to talk about. And so that is an ongoing conversation. It's really important for the charity sector that we're able to support people as best we can and to support the government in pushing forward in that endeavour as well. On the flip side, I entirely agree with Balbir in what she said. It's so great to see minimum wage going up and to see young people better able to afford to live. Fundamentally, it goes back to what I said before in terms of the level of demand. People need more money, but that fundamental of people needing more money, it does also go back to the point around national insurance. So there's a sort of twofold answer to that question, but it is quite early to answer the question of what that will mean in terms of our delivery as charities as well.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Just going to move on swiftly to just make up some time. We're going to come to Nashaba to ask a question too.
Thank you, Florence. So we're often told that there are very complex reasons why people specifically end up rough sleeping. So it would just be helpful to understand what you think what you think sort of why certain groups are particularly impacted or more likely to be rough sleeping than others. And maybe if I come to Dr. Carin first, yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Very happy to talk to that. Thank you. Great question. So on official statistics, when you look at who rough sleepers are, you will find mostly white British men. But from the research that I've been doing with Albert Kennedy Trust and also with English Rural, we're missing a huge part of the rough sleeping population. So what we don't have is appropriate data that actually demonstrates or shows what I would say is probably a tip of an iceberg of what we do know about rough sleeping. So what we need is to focus more on the intersecting protected characteristics that of people that will make them more susceptible to homelessness and to rough sleeping. But a lot of them are hidden. So either they can be hidden because they live in rural areas, and we've learned from CPR recently that rural homelessness, rural rough sleeping has increased by 40% in the last 5 years. We know from the women's census that there are more women rough sleeping than show up in the official statistics. There's a young person's census recently done as well. We know that there are more young people rough sleeping. I'll give an example from our recent research. One of the young people we spoke to was placed in temporary accommodation that wasn't suitable. It wasn't safe. They were a trans young person. They were subject to really overt discrimination and couldn't stay there. Instead, spent 7 months sleeping on buses. 7 months on a bus. And that is not a person that will show up in our statistics. So what we do need to do is focus more on the hidden populations among rough sleepers and not get single-tracked by what we can see in the data.
Might I come in on that, if at all possible? I think, first of all, I'd quite like just to even put on the record the average age of death of a person who is homeless in the UK is in their 40s. And I think that's something that it's important to have in context when we have this conversation. But a lot of those people remain unnamed. You know, just last week we had the annual service of commemoration for people who've died whilst homeless. A number of those people were unnamed at that service. And one of those the reasons that those people remain unnamed is because of exactly what we've just heard. We can't count a lot of these people. They are hidden homeless. And sadly, a lot of these people are women. They're people with protected characteristics. We know that a lot of women especially have to hide their homelessness because ultimately sleeping on the streets, it's not safe, to say the complete obvious. And so we know that a lot of women will find them sleeping on buses, will find them in hospital waiting rooms and such places like that to informally find ways to sleep and get through the night. But that context of how people are living, why they're living that way, and how long they are expected to live, I think it's just important to have that when we have this conversation.
Sorry, could I add something? I think it's brilliant that the colleagues are drilling down into the granular issues. But I would say that one of the overriding problems that we have, 90% of the people that I have dealt with for decade after decade after decade have come from the same socio-economic group, largely white, largely inheritors of poverty. If you inherit poverty, there's my wife's family inherited poverty. They come from India. They didn't capitulate. What they did was they saved everything. They knew how to cook. They knew how to make a pound last. So they got out of it. So my father-in-law, who was a bus driver, ended up putting all of his children through the university, owning a house in Punjab and all sorts of things, because he knew how to do it. My family, who were Irish, were destroyed by poverty, destroyed by imperialism, 1,000 years of imperialism. And the thing was, that is why I ended up homeless, because 90%, as I say, 90% of the people I meet are people who have inherited poverty, and they never get over that. Some of them, and a lot of immigrants are much, much better at that. My mate Danny, who's a Chinese Jamaican, has many houses. He's learnt skills and abilities. Unfortunately, a lot of the indigenous white people have not got those skills. When I go to Africa, and work in Africa, I see people who turn poverty into its opposite. And until we address that issue of inherited poverty, especially amongst the white working class, then we are going to get people who are rioting, who are going to go to Middlesbrough and attack a mosque. A mosque, by the way, we worked with that mosque. A mosque that provided 2,000 meals a month to the most needy in Middlesbrough.
Thank you. Lewis, I think we're going to discuss some of the barriers and support for people facing sleeping.
So when someone ends up homeless, how easy is it for them to access support, and how long does it take them to get the support that they need? Because I think it's fair to say that we can say there is support out there, probably not enough. And what are the main barriers then for that person or the individual to access that?
I mean, let me talk about young people. Excuse me. So a lot of young people don't know where to go for support. So that's one thing. We need to tell young people excuse me, that they can go to the local authority. There's charities they can go to. But also, I've also already talked about gatekeeping. So they don't even get to talk to somebody at the local authority. You would be surprised, local authorities don't advertise the numbers for their housing options. So actually it's impossible to get through to them. So those are massive barriers. The other thing for us is that at Centrepoint, we work with the young people that local authorities actually refer to us. So you can't walk off the streets and come to a Centrepoint hostel. So again, there's no self-referral, which is a barrier as well. So those are the barriers systematically put in front of young people before they can get a service. One of the solutions for us is actually Housing First, which I know you'll be talking about this afternoon. But it means that young people have got a safe place to stay, and then you've got all the support services around them. We run Housing First, and we know it works for young people, particularly for care leavers.
And then just to follow up on that, so how long is the average that you would say, and I get you might not be able to know this, that someone would spend sleeping homeless before they get access to any sort of help?
You know what? I can't give you an average figure. What I would say to you is just to reiterate, sometimes young people don't even get there because they're not picked up. So, as Alicia was saying, young people are really vulnerable because they're vulnerable to abuse, to exploitation on the streets. They do not sleep in the places where others sleep and they'll be verified and picked up. They sleep, we've got examples of young people sleeping in graveyards, young people sleeping night buses, young people sleeping in cars and garages or all-night cafes. Because actually, and they're not going to get picked up by anybody, they're not going to get the support.
Sorry, can I make a point? We spend a lot of time in the West End and other cities, and we go round and we pick up anecdotal evidence. There are many, many young people. I was one of them. I was a trailblazer 50 years ago, sleeping rough in graveyards, in various other places. I was a runaway from home, runaway from the police. And I can honestly tell you that it is appalling, even today, to have all these organisations and you can't get through to them because largely everybody in the homeless sector is suffering an inability because of funds and support to actually do that. And I'm sorry, but until we put money into the organisations, the Big Issue, Centrepoint, all these other organisations who are the street providers, until we do that, we are screwed.
On the edges. Thank you. Dr. Carin wanted to come and then Lewis, round up, please.
Thank you. So, yes, I think one of the really big problems here is that we can't really say what the average waiting times are because it's different for everyone. You make an application through the Housing Act 97, Part 7, and you get determined whether you're priority need, if you're intentionally homeless, and so on. And the issue is here, who do we choose? Who is priority need? How do we decide who needs the help more than someone else? Only about 30%, I think, but I can look at the exact figure, actually get statutory help from the local authorities. So there's a huge amount of people who apply as homeless who don't get that support, or who will be referred back into the private rented sector where discrimination is rife. And young people have very little chance of ever finding something for a suitable price. So waiting is one of the most prominent things that happen once you become homeless. You're waiting for appointments with the job centre. You're waiting for appointments for health, for mental health. You may never get an appointment. For housing, you will perhaps get an appointment to see somebody who tells you you need to go and find your own flat. Let me give you some suggestions. Local authorities are working really hard to try and place people, but they don't have anywhere to place them, let alone any money to spend on the temporary accommodation that's needed. If you look at the UK in a sense of temporary accommodation use, we're skyrocketing compared to other countries. So what the fundamental problem is that there is a build-up of people needing help and support and somewhere to live, and they don't have anywhere to go. And we also don't have suitable accommodation for different types of needs. If you're a person that goes to the council and you have a disability, is there going to be a suitable flat for you to live in for living with that disability? Probably not. So what we really need to look at is, how can we do to provide better options to prevent those barriers from actually being there.
Okay. And Joe, you wanted to come in really quickly.
Just a quick question, which is how from a homeless person's perspective, how do you engage them to understand better how these services could be organised? Do you have, because it's obviously quite tricky, right? But it's really important they have a voice. How do you engage them to understand how it could be done better?
Can I just clarify? Do you mean how do we engage them? How do we
design the services and to access the services better?
Right, okay. How do we engage them to design the services?
Yeah, how do they have a voice in the types? Because obviously, policy across government tends to be set with the users of the. But I'm just curious because it's really you're talking about all these offers that are kind of quite difficult to access. So I'm trying to understand how, from their perspective, they can get that support.
So where the work that you all do comes in, for example.
So what we do is we actually work with the young people that we support, because participation and real involvement is really important. When they come to us, we ask them how they got to us, and then we will talk to them about some of the barriers, what worked and what didn't work. Then we will feed that back to some of the local authorities that we work with, because actually, you're right, they're at the front line. Homeless young people who come to us at the front line, and we need them to help design and deliver the services that are on offer to them, either from local authorities or from charities.
Sorry, can I jump in?
I'll just get Chris, and then you can.
I was just going to ask if you're doing surveys effectively there. Do you make that data accessible as a way of seeing it?
We normally talk to the local authorities, to be honest, rather than tell everybody about it, because it's quite specific to each local authority.
So, could I say something?
Very quickly, Lord Bad.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a real pain in the arse because I believe so much in prevention. If only somebody could have prevented the scumbag that I became, a racist scumbag, underclass person who millions of pounds was spent on. If only there had been some allocation of funding. My brother, who is costing millions of pounds, ex-homeless, ex-everything, and now in a place where it costs £14,000 a month to support him. If only we could get you lot to have get rid of your mind-forged manacles. You are always worshipping at the altar of the accomplished fact. We are responding to that emergency. Why is it that none of you say, how the F in hell can we prevent this from happening? You are not politicians.
That's some of the things that we're looking at as a committee.
Well, please,
making those clear recommendations
please
to the
move. 80% of all
government
government money spent on social intervention is spent on emergency and coping, and very little is spent on prevention and cure.
I think we've got the message.
And
Lord Bird.
We are providers. We are providers to emergency, but we need to be made unemployed.
Yeah.
And it's your job to do it. Please move the argument.
We'll be pressing on that when we meet the Secretary of State, don't worry. Lee's going to come in on some issues local authorities are facing.
Yeah, so I mean, you touched on not publishing housing option numbers, temporary accommodation, and feeding back to LA. So, what do you think the limitations are in terms of the approach the local authorities take on tackling rough sleeping?
The kind of primary reason is a lack of resources. Most of them actually do want to help the young people that come to them. And they want to assess everybody that comes to them, but actually they haven't got the resources to do it. So that's one thing. The second thing is, which is connected obviously, there's not enough youth-specific emergency accommodation.
I'm going to go, sorry. Thank you. I've really appreciated the chance of coming here. But I don't want to hear this. I've heard this for the last 30 years. I've heard it from every government, irrespective of their political complexion. I don't want to be a part of a farce. Until we start turning the tap off, we're screwed.
Thank you, Lord Bird.
So, won't get to hear my second question, which was all about that, but never mind.
So, not enough resources, and that means there's not enough youth-specific temporary accommodation. And we need that because young people, they don't want to be in temporary accommodation with adults. They don't feel safe there. We've got to have youth-specific emergency accommodation for young people. And can I just say one of the other things really important for local authorities to be funding family support. We do not want young people or anybody going through the trauma of homelessness. We've got to get in there early.
Prevention, I would say.
Exactly. Absolutely. I was trying. Yes, definitely.
And then, so a follow-up from me. So, what do you think the impact is on other public services, such as health and the police, for example, in terms of homelessness causing that, causing that pressure onto them? And does that then cost the state more in the long term than putting them in a housing first?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we did some research last year. Youth homelessness costs 8.5 billion. 8.5 billion, which is services, whether it's kind of, NHS, criminal justice system, but also it's a loss of productivity, all that potential going to waste.
Thanks.
Sharma.
Just a very quick follow-up. So I appreciate everything that you said around the challenges that local authorities have faced. Obviously, that's something as a committee we've been talking a lot about already. But do you think there are any examples of best practice or good practice that we could perhaps learn from and look at where local authorities are perhaps going above and beyond or getting it right in a way that others aren't able to?
We've been working really closely with Lambeth, and they've been working in partnership with charities in the area, and obviously Prince of Wales's Homewards initiative has really galvanised people in the local area, charities, and there seems to be now a kind of a pathway of services for people which didn't really exist before, and they're really majoring on prevention and housing first as well.
That's Carin.
In agreement around housing first, absolutely a way to go forward. I just wanted to respond also a little bit to the what the local authorities are doing to tackling what the barriers are there. There are instances of very, very good practice. There are fantastic people in local authorities working very hard, and agreed they don't have the money to do what they need to do. But I would like to also emphasise, so we've got, it's the time for SWEP. This is a really good time to think about that, severe weather emergency protocol. Are we doing the best thing for all types of rough sleepers? Churches are often places that take up the SWEP provision. Is that the right place for everyone? Perhaps not. Churches do a fantastic job, but it is not the most suitable place for everybody to be, particularly people from other faith-based communities or people from LGBTQ plus communities. So we do need to think about that. We also need to think about what happens to people who don't feel like it's possible to go into SWEP provision. We want to be preventing deaths here. It's cold weather coming up. If you can't go into a big hall with lots of other people because you're suffering from anxiety or because of disability, for example, are we thinking about the funding for local authorities to help those people rather than leave them out in the cold? I do think that we need more training in terms of looking at different types of needs in local authorities. In our most recent research, we found that 47% of local authorities didn't have enough knowledge. They stated themselves didn't have enough knowledge in supporting LGBTQ plus people, for example, and they are twice as likely to experience hidden homelessness. So there is a lot to be done in terms of what and how we can support local authority to do the job that is so necessary, especially coming up to the cold months.
So quickly then.
If I may, I'll make two really quick points just in addition, because I entirely agree with what's already been said. I think, first of all, it's really important to note that 1 in 4 people who are sleeping rough in the UK are non-UK nationals. And so that means that they have no recourse to public funds and they don't really have any options in terms of where to go. Our advisors regularly have to inform people that they can't help them. And so in this conversation around rights, we need to really think about who has rights and how we support all of the people who are currently sleeping rough and have nowhere to go. I also think in this conversation around rights, we have to understand that trust is a real issue. I think you had a brilliant question earlier around how to involve people with lived experience. Trust is a big issue. If you've ended up on the streets, the likelihood is that many systems have failed you, not just one system, be it the care system, the education system, the prison system, some sort of system has failed you, or we haven't acknowledged sufficiently as a society that safety nets aren't there for absolutely everybody. And if those safety nets aren't there, the trust also isn't there to go to your local authority and get proper support. And as has been really eloquently said, then you're met with gatekeeping and the trust is further eroded. So I think we've got two issues of understanding who has rights in the first place. And then second of all, when those rights are exercised, do people even trust that that's going to make a difference at all?
Thank you. Will's going to wrap up this session for us.
I've got sort of a two-parter to conclude. We've talked about the importance that local authorities can help solve this, but actually if you look at the numbers, around half of rough sleepers in the country are London and South East based, way disproportionately. Does that mean you actually need national intervention, not relying on local? So I'd sort of welcome your comment. But if you did have the Secretary of State with us now, what would be the one request, bit of advice you would have for them to end rough sleeping for good?
Start with you, Alicia.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to start with your second question, actually, because I think it actually answers the first one. And as someone from Shelter, I'm sure you won't be surprised, we need to build more affordable social rent homes. The issue that we're currently talking about is that there is nowhere for enough people to go in this country. We do not have enough homes to house the number of people who are here. There isn't enough trust in the system because there aren't enough homes. The number one thing that we need to do in this country is to start to build more social rented homes, and what we recommend is 90k social homes per year. That is the number way to solve the housing emergency, and we won't end rough sleeping until we have solved the housing emergency. And so we do need to take a national picture because we need to understand that this is a national problem, but in doing so we need to look at the local as well. Ultimately, the responses to the housing emergency are different depending on where you are, but ultimately we do need to build more social homes.
I wanted to first respond to the numbers question. The issue with the rough sleeping numbers is that, of course, it's much easier to count rough sleeping in big areas, urban areas. We need to take a place-based approach to looking at our numbers. The rough sleeping figures, as we know now, coming from the snapshot data, is not a reliable source to place all our decisions or base all our decisions on. What we need is to look at more place-based solutions and look at the different needs in different types of areas. So that is absolutely key. I also believe that the task of the government needs to be to drastically improve support and protection for groups with intersecting social disadvantages who are more likely to experience homelessness and rough sleeping, and also at more risk of harm when they do. So I've already mentioned LGBTQ plus people, young people, ethnic minority backgrounds, physical disabilities, neurodiversity, and people with mental health issues. They all need more protection, and this is urgent.
Right, I'm not going to repeat anything that you've said. So for me, if she was now sitting right here in front of us, I would say, please focus on prevention. And we need a youth-specific element of the strategy. Homelessness is different for young people. The solutions are different.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our guest. And if Lord Bird was here, we did get to the prevention bit in the end, and we'll continue speaking about this. But thank you to our guests, and we'll switch over to our next panel now.
Thank you.
Housing and Partnerships at Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council.
Good morning, I'm Sophie Boobis. I'm Head of Policy and Research at Homeless Link.
I'm Councillor Adam Hugg. I'm the LGA's Housing Spokesman and Leader of Westminster Council.
I'm Paul Dennett. I'm the Mayor of Salford and the Deputy Mayor for Greater Manchester.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning for our second panel. Obviously, you heard some of the comments from the first Q&A session. And one of the things that I wanted to start on is around the issue of rough sleeping. It's been said that it wasn't mentioned in the Labour manifesto or any of the bills introduced by the new government, but we do have a Minister for Rough Sleeping and Homelessness, Rushnara Ali, and you'll be aware that the Deputy Prime Minister has launched a new task force specifically looking at this, and it's interdepartmental looking at, so it's not just sitting within MCHLG. What do you think are the most effective ways for us to tackle the issue of rough sleeping? Ben?
Okay, so predictably to start with prevention, but understanding the local demand drivers around how best to use prevention to create positive and long-lasting solutions. It's really important that we better use data and evidence to understand how local delivery is effective. We've improved that over the last 12 months, but it's not systemic within all local authorities. And I think it's really important that we do that. Alongside that, co-designing services in partnership with our local system is really critical. Using public services, community and voluntary sector, and charities to understand how best to deliver solutions in a local context is really critical alongside that data and evidence.
I think recognising that rough sleeping is obviously part of the broader homelessness problem, but it is also has its own discrete challenges, because ultimately, and I think obviously this is particularly true for metropolitan boroughs like mine, we're not just dealing with, only 5% of my rough sleepers on the streets of Westminster have a local connection. Where systems fail across the country, whether that's in terms of housing, whether that's in terms of mental health, whether that's in terms of substance abuse, that pushes people onto, and it makes them less willing to automatically accept homelessness provision that may be available where they live, and ultimately it means that they end up on the streets with higher barriers to coming back into statutory services, and obviously we have to spend more to deal with people in crisis on our streets. So I think obviously the broader point about prevention, it isn't, so homelessness, greater investment in homelessness prevention is very helpful, but it is looking at those wider services that need to be in communities across the country, that sit alongside what you're doing when people immediately hit the streets now, because some people who will arrive will be able to be signposted and get support and come off the streets. Other people will be entrenched for a long time, and that involves incredibly difficult work with cross-departmental with health sector and everything else to try and encourage people into housing. So there's it costs an awful lot more by the time it gets there, and obviously some of the solutions are going to need to be things like specialist and supported housing rather than just the main pathways for building more homes.
Sophie, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's also about acknowledging that rough sleeping is a symptom of much more kind of systematic, wider support needs. So the cross-government working, both at a national and at a local level, at a local systems level. So considering the drivers behind rough sleeping as part of the prevention aspect, but also the solutions and the support system that needs to be built in to help people off the streets. So that's looking at mental health, it's looking at physical health. We know that rough sleeping makes people physically unwell as much as it drives trauma and mental ill health. Social care, addiction services, all the things that sort of drive trauma, both as a cause of homelessness and rough sleeping, but also as a consequence of. So it's about factoring that into prevention understanding, so the importance of the wider system playing their role in preventing homelessness. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, but also building support services that factor that in, so that looks at the housing element, the accommodation element is only one part of the solution here. So we need a system that is much more comprehensive, that has access to appropriate supported housing, housing first models, but also the work that needs to be invested before people reach that stage. So whether that's in really effective assertive outreach that does the hard work of building relationships with people on the streets, building that trust, building that engagement, the day centres, the night shelters, they're all part of that system, and it needs to be joined up. It needs to be kind of responding to local sort of different support needs and demographics, and it needs to be linked into the bigger system. It doesn't exist in isolation.
Or is there anything you wanted to add to this?
So I think in terms of Greater Manchester's learning on tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, I agree with the comments already made about rough sleeping only being part of the homelessness landscape. And ultimately, we've not got the luxury to only think about prevention. We also have to respond to the humanitarian crisis that is rough sleeping and a homelessness crisis engulfing this country currently. And I think for me, some of the work that's being talked about in terms of cross-departmental, cross-ministerial is absolutely where the solutions to this issue are to be found, because it's not just within MHCLG. It's what the Home Office are doing. It's what the DWP have been doing in terms of welfare reform over the last 14 years. And thinking systemically about this as one government, I think we can find some meaningful solutions to this. But I would also say part of the solution is subsidiarity, so devolution. And, the English devolution bill, I think, will provide some of the answers to how to respond to the crisis. Local government, people working at a community, neighbourhood level are best placed, in my opinion, to be able to advise on how best to respond to what is a national crisis.
Lee?
But just coming, so I agree it's a national crisis, but going back to Adam's point, only 5% of rough sleepers in your council area have got a local connection. Do you think that law needs changing? The focus of the local connection needs changing, because otherwise Adam's council's never going to have the resource necessarily to deal with that other 95%.
So, this is really interesting, because if you was to look at homelessness and rough sleeping across the country, you'll probably find urban areas around cities are where we have the biggest challenge. And interestingly as well, in terms of the placement of people seeking asylum and refugees, you'll also find urban areas are the parts of the country where those are most concentrated, inevitably. So any local urban area only has a finite capacity in terms of how we can support and tackle this issue. And, when you look at the antecedents to this, be that the chronic undersupply of council housing, right to buy, and the fact that 40% of homes purchased under right to buy find their way into the private rented sector. Many of them have never been replaced, and they've certainly not been replaced at social rents or rents capped at the local housing allowance. Look at some of the stuff around the national planning policy framework and the inability to capture land value currently, which is obviously having huge viability constraints up and down the country. Developers aren't building truly affordable housing, and then you throw into the mix 40 14 years of austerity, which has totally ripped out the capacity in local government to be able to respond to this national crisis. Throw into the mix welfare reform as well, and you've got a very toxic environment. And arguably, it's the environment, it's the system that is driving homelessness and rough sleeping. It is not a lifestyle choice.
That is still the issue for Adam, isn't it?
No, but I mean, I don't disagree with anything Paul said. I mean, you've got to sort the wider homelessness crisis, and that means building more homes, tackling issues around the gap between the LHA rates and that's to stabilise the private rented sector, to enable councils to be able to provide the provision in general terms. But then there is also the case about the more specialist needs of people who are coming onto the streets, who are not just people who are looking for a home and can be turned around quite quickly. It's that more entrenched stuff, which is what you see on the streets of Westminster and other urban areas where other systems have failed across the country. So it's looking at those drivers in terms of mental health and substance abuse as well that are key, and obviously the issues around the Home Office kick out. Obviously, one of the big flows that we're seeing at the moment, obviously not just us but other councils as well, is where people have been placed poorly coming out of Home Office accommodation and they're then coming onto the streets. So
big issue. Lewis.
Yep, thank you. And I'll just say I am a councillor on an upper tier authority, Hertfordshire County Council, so we don't have responsibility for homelessness. But Adam, you just said you want to build more homes. So what's your view on the Secretary of State's view then that the housing target in London is going to be reduced by 20%, so you're going to build less in London? But you've just said we should build more homes. Do you think that's fair?
I think we have to build more homes of all tenure and all types. I think the previous government's urban uplift formula was bluntly a very crude tool to mean that certain other parts of the country weren't playing their fair share. I would note under the current formula the housing target that's been given to us has quadrupled, and I don't think you actually want us building on Hyde Park. So I think there's practical challenges about making sure that you are unlocking building in urban areas, and normally the issues there around the fact that there are already buildings on those sites. So certainly in inner London, there are not many empty brownfield sites available. Obviously, it changes the further out you go. But we want it's what are the tools to unlock truly affordable house building and overall house building in urban areas, so that you're maximising them. Every council I know wants to build, but it is incredibly challenging in the inner urban sites. What can you do on the urban periphery, and how can you manage that approach? And obviously the government's looking at the reform of the Greenbelt, and then obviously it's how can you meet the different challenges in rural areas when you're also looking at issues around protecting agriculture, but also our climate and energy commitments. So there are lots of different land use things, but ultimately we need more homes of all tenures of all types in all places, but it's got to be pragmatic about what they can actually deliver. Because as I said, I want to build more homes, I desperately want to build more homes. If our target goes up to 4,000 homes a year, which is what under the current formula would do, I need to have a conversation that people stop building offices, because at the moment the private sector just wants to build offices. I'm building like gangbusters as a council on our land. But if someone wants to stop the building offices and build resi, we're not going to get those numbers. But it's looking at each local area about how you unlock the maximum housing you can deliver, and no part of the country can leave that. But the previous government obviously just said, "Oh right, just cities will do it."
Do you think London should build less?
No, I think London should build more wherever it can, and how do you work with local authorities to unlock those opportunities. I do not know a London council that is trying to avoid building, they're all desperate to build. It's about the money, it's about the planning powers, and it's about how do you get land assembly in a place like London. So particularly in inner London, there are lots of buildings in it. If you find me the space, I'll build on it or get someone to build on it. So I'm sure where you are, there's obviously space, but it's about how it's effectively managed.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's draw it back to what we were discussing this morning. Thank you very much. I'm moving on to Maya.
If we just bring it back a bit to sort of tackling the immediate crisis, could you talk me through a little bit sort of the examples of what has worked well in previous governments' approaches and local governments to tackling the challenge? And I'm interested, just building on what you talked about, Paul, in terms of how you feel, who the key organisations are in local areas that can really support that, and who have done, how you've worked well with them.
So, speaking from a Greater Manchester point of view, since 2017, we've seen a 45% decrease in rough sleeping. And some of this comes down to political leadership. Mayor Burnham has made tackling homelessness and rough sleeping his number one policy priority and continues to do that. But also, it's not just about political leadership. It's about how we've used devolution to have conversations with government to actually play ball with us in terms of tackling the wider determinants of homelessness and rough sleeping, but also the immediate crisis that we were facing. So, over the last 5 years, we've invested £33 million in Mayor Burnham's Bed Every Night initiative. That's an immediate response to people who find themselves in the awful situation of sleeping rough on our streets for a number of reasons, some to do with the Homelessness Reduction Act in England, which, as we know, is different to Scotland. And bizarrely, we owe a duty to some people and we don't seemingly owe a duty to other. The legislation is forcing us to decide between who are seemingly the deserving and undeserving of temporary accommodation in England. But in addition to that, we've also piloted in Greater Manchester Housing First, which has been a great success. And I know MHCLG recently has published an evaluation of Housing First, and I think it agrees certainly with our approach. I mean, there's 7 principles to Housing First: the right to a home, flexible support, the separation of housing and the support that needs to sit around the individual. Really an important aspect of that. Giving people, individuals, choice and control, active engagement, a service based on people's strengths, goals, their aspirations. It's very much person-centric. And also a harm reduction approach, trauma-informed. And since the first referral, this is when we did our evaluation in October 2021, we've seen 442 people referred, 358, 81% are still on the programme in June 2021. And at June 2021, 257 people had been housed under the pilot and 221 into their own property. And this is a cohort of rough sleepers that are entrenched, that are repeat, that have all of those complex needs in terms of drug and alcohol addiction, mental health issues, physical needs. Some have experienced domestic abuse and violence. Some have come out of the criminal justice system. So we're talking about a really difficult cohort of people from a service point of view. And actually, Housing First has delivered fantastic outcomes for that cohort. And again, it all comes down to political leadership. We've also got the collaboration and the partnership across the 10 local authorities working together under the umbrella and rubric of the combined authority, but also placing co-production and lived experience at the heart of our model, both in terms of the strategy, but also in terms of the delivery. We have people who've experienced homelessness literally informing us about what decisions we should take day in, day out, holding us to account as politicians through the programme board, shaping the prevention strategy within Greater Manchester. This whole notion of co-production, thinking beyond the public sector, ultimately is where some of the solutions to this problem are found, as well as the government speaking with one voice, but speaking with local government, city, regional government, and harnessing devolution to genuinely tackle this issue. I think there's something in this that we can literally operationalise across the country.
I'm just interested from the others, do you feel, obviously from the experiences you've had or past successful experiences, is devolution and those kind of powers a prerequisite for some of that success, or are there other examples where you've managed to have success without that kind of devolved power?
So, we've received a range of different government grants in order to tackle this issue, specifically targeting different cohorts and groups. Each of them provides successes, but they're not joined up. So we received grants to assist care leavers, accommodation for ex-offenders. The Rough Sleepers initiative has been really significantly life-changing for a number of people because it provides accommodation and the support for a targeted group, and they're all successful in their own programs, but they're not joined up, and we would be receiving far better value if we were able to do that. We've had similar successes with respect to Housing First and the fidelity to the principles mentioned, but on a much smaller scale. We could spend our resource that we provide to Housing First 2, 3, 4 times over, because that's the level of demand that we're experiencing. We understand some of those solutions, but we do need some greater collaboration about how those grants are administered.
I think there's definitely an element of local-led drive that is really important, because rough sleeping, the people who are presenting as rough sleeping are different in different local areas, whether it's urban regions, rural, but there are examples of effective schemes that were at a national level. So if we look not too distant past, the Everyone In scheme during the pandemic, if we go a bit further back, Supporting People as a programme, these were effective interventions. And alongside Housing First, they have very similar principles, and then what they did was the funding and the drive separated the support from the conditionality of accommodation. So that's one of the core principles of Housing First. In Everyone In, during the pandemic, that's what happened. People were given a house, accommodation, whether it was hotel or whatever form it was, and the support came to them. They weren't going to lose that accommodation because that was a public health drive. That was nothing to do with tackling their rough sleeping. It was, we need to bring people in for health reasons, but whilst we have you in, let's bring the support to you. The same model when we had the Supporting People funding. At the moment, much of that supported accommodation is funded through housing benefit, which means it's very, very conditional on the actual provision of the house and the home. Whereas Supporting People, it was focused on the support provided. And so there is principles of national-led strategies that have been effective. I think they are most effective when they are then able to flex to local-driven demand. So I think it's a top-down and bottom-up approach that's really driven that effectiveness.
And I think the key thing is financial certainty. I think we're coming to the end of our current RSI period, and we're looking to see whether that will be extended past May 2025. But the key thing is if we're planning services over a number of years, it's just having that certainty so we can procure and get those things right. But in London, there is a well-established GLA-led process, because ultimately the rough sleepers on my streets will wander over into Camden and they won't necessarily know, stop at the border and things like that. That's not how it works. So that there is a lot that you can do, and obviously second night out hubs and stuff like that were being developed in London over time, that shows there's great advantages in collaboration, but obviously a lot of the services are delivered still at a local level, and that's and in partnership with our local voluntary sector. So just going back to something I heard in the previous session, supporting the voluntary sector partners who are all struggling as well, because our ecosystem involves partnership working, and our services have been hit by the financial difficulties that some of our providers are facing, and that means we have to then find more money in emergency to deal with the fact they've had to sell off assets to fund the financial
You're effectively
challenges.
picking that up as well. Okay with that.
Yeah, that's great.
Moving on swiftly, you've touched on Housing First, but Nashaba has a few more.
Yes, thank you. I was going to ask Paul a bit more detail about that, but obviously you've talked very passionately about it there and how it works as the panel. So I think my next question was just, obviously, where I've seen examples of Housing First, there are areas where it works very, very well, as we've heard. There are some areas where perhaps it hasn't quite had the impact that we would hope it would do. So what support do you think local authorities need to successfully implement a Housing First scheme, and how do we ensure that it has the kind of impact and outcomes that we intend it to as well across the piece, and there's consistency in delivery?
Yeah, as you say, we've seen Housing First be very effective, but there are definitely barriers to its delivery. One of the biggest, it comes back again to funding and long-term certainty. The principle of Housing First is open-ended support. It is long-term security of that accommodation and that support. If you are funding your Housing First services, as many of them are, particularly outside of the pilots, through short-term grant funding, that can never be there, so that can undermine the whole concept. It sort of takes away the sort of ability to invest. There's also a challenge with access to appropriate housing. You need a lot of one-bedroom properties for Housing First. If there is not sufficient, appropriate, available tenure, affordable tenure, then that will also be a challenge. And just the sort of the resource available and the support available to maintain high-fidelity Housing First interventions. They are very cost-effective, but they have a high kind of upstart cost in terms of delivering. So local authorities need to be funded sufficiently to be able to then provide those services. But when they do work, they work incredibly effectively. And I think the other side is the role of the other parts of the system. So Housing First works when mental health play their role, when social care play their role, when substance misuse services. If they are not equally round the table and building that partnership, then those people can't actually access the support that they need to then be able to sustain their tenancy and to develop the sort of positive environment life that they need to move on from rough sleeping and homelessness.
Anything to add, Adam?
I think obviously we're currently developing that, and we've got some positive work on survivors of domestic violence and sort of targeted housing first options. I think there are particular challenges on it when dealing with housing in London, particularly in terms of getting the scale and in the context of the broader housing crisis that we've got, and as I mentioned earlier, the sort of the cohorts that we have coming through. But I think but we still need to build more of it, and we also, as going back to my point, we need stuff around supported accommodation, because it's that sort of people who can get someone in and do that intensive work with people with multiple substance or mental health abuse issues that need to be addressed. It's that being able to work with people so that they're actually ready to go into more normal types of accommodation. So that's absolutely critical.
The only thing I'd add is that because of the multifaceted approach to housing first, housing related support and council budgets in that my housing budget pays for nurses, social workers, the other elements of housing first in order to make it work, because otherwise it wouldn't work. So we really need some thinking about how we can resource that in a sustainable way long term.
And you do find that you struggle to get buy-in from funding side from the healthcare service and those other...
It's a challenge in order to provide that fidelity to the model that we know is evidence-based and it works. We've used it for Housing First to work with young people, so we've got Housing First young people's projects, women-only projects, and the entrenched, more traditional rough sleeper group, but it is a challenge in terms of resourcing.
We're going to move on to resource, and maybe you can come in there, Paul.
Yeah, no, I was just going to agree with my colleague there, because you're absolutely right. Getting money out of the health system is not easy, and the loops you have to jump through in terms of cost-benefit analysis and proving your case is quite significant. And I think there is something in this which is much broader and much more systemic that we do need to think about. Obviously, at the moment, we're going through the latest round of NHS reforms that were brought about in the middle of a global pandemic. They've yet to bed in, and I think, integrated care systems, I think for me, the jury's out on their efficacy in terms of whether or not they're improving outcomes. But fundamentally, I think for me, when you look at the overall budget of the Department for Health and Social Care at for 25, 26, 200 billion, over 200 billion, juxtapose that with local government, which, I think is around 15 billion, you kind of quickly realise, are we ever going to get into the wider determinants of health and well-being here? Because if we are, and if we're serious about prevention, then we need to start shifting money into those wider determinants of health and well-being. We've heard a lot about the voluntary community, faith and social enterprise sector. I'm very worried about that sector of the economy, both in terms of the impact of the last 14 years, the COVID pandemic, cost of living crisis, the use of their reserves. We've heavily relied on that sector of the economy as the state, and actually that is really teetering on falling over if we're not careful, and that will have huge consequences for the homelessness and rough sleeping agenda.
Thank you. We're going to move on to funding. Chris.
I'll start with an open-ended one. Is the current level of funding for local authorities received to tackle rough sleeping adequate? If you want to start us off, Adam. I think I suspect I know the answer to this one.
Unfortunately, it isn't.
Yeah.
I think, obviously, the two recent interventions are helpful. Obviously, we've got the additional 233 million into prevention, which is obviously helping with homelessness writ large. But obviously, as we've discussed, it's helping people before they end up coming onto the streets. And then obviously the emergency £10 million in funding that will is currently being distributed at the moment is helpful. But the key thing is actually having long-term consistency in rough sleeping support, so we can plan our services. And then it is coming back to the wider issues around local government funding, and particularly the TA crisis that we're dealing with. Ultimately, we need to stabilise the PRS. We need to reform the housing benefit levels so they actually catch up with where we are today. I mean, we need them to be uprated to the 2020, 90% of the 2024 local housing allowance rates to actually give that stability in the market. And then also on the council side, in terms of us being able to procure accommodation ourselves, it's making sure that councils can get the same amount of whatever housing benefits available as private landlords, because at the moment the rates that local authorities get are frozen at 2011 rates rather than the the current ones. So there's some structural challenges there that would help tackle homelessness writ large, and that greater investment in prevention is helpful. But in terms of tackling rough sleeping specifically, it's those longer term funding, regional collaboration, and then getting the health service more in the game in terms of and to tackle some of those really deep rooted issues around mental health and substance use. Ultimately, the mental health hospital that's used to provide support to my rough sleeping community in and around Victoria and the West End, that was closed during the pandemic and has never reopened. That's a fundamental challenge that previously our outreach teams were able to physically walk people in mental health crisis to the hospital, and that's now no longer there. So it's the knock-on effect of a range of different changes, so it'll be helpful.
Okay, just go to Ben after that. You've got about 200,000, I think, from the rough sleeping winter pressures funding for this year. Can you give us an idea about what a lump sum like that is going to pay for and what material difference it's going to make in your area?
I think the first thing, the funding is welcomed. It's challenging to spend that kind of grant funding in what effectively is 4 months. What it will go to is providing more emergency accommodation provision. So that will help. It is challenging to resource the staff that are required and the support workers within that timescale in order for it to be long lasting. It will protect and it will save lives this winter. The preference would be that we'd have that over a commitment over a longer term, so we can better spend money on things that are more preventative rather than the more expensive crisis intervention activities. So floating support for single people where we know that there are some characteristics in people's lives that mean that they're more likely to become rough sleeping, targeting areas more upstream is where we should focus that resource.
I think, Lewis, you wanted to come in quick.
Yeah, no, if I can. And Adam and Paul, you've both mentioned the health service and trying to get them on board more. And my question is, obviously, you represent big metropolitan areas, both with elected mayors. If they can't get into the health service, how does the rest of local government do it? Like, they're quite powerful, got lots of levers at their disposal. How would you say they need to better get in with the NHS? Because if they can't, the rest of local government is going to even more be a challenge to them. Does that make sense?
I think it may be different between the two areas.
Fact,
because the GLA doesn't have a role in healthcare at all, and I think there is more.
But what I mean is,
so in terms of, there may well be a case for further devolution around certain health powers from central government to a regional level, and at the moment, I think that's something that is obviously under discussion nationally. But as I said, at the moment, the relationships with the health sector are held by local authorities in London, and I think the ICB changes have proved challenging because the areas that we're dealing with are so big that makes it very difficult for the local authority reps on there to provide accountability there. So I think there is a thinking again about some of the governance structure around ICBs to improve the role of local decision. The influence of locally elected officials, whether that's at a local council level or at a regional level. But yeah, in London they don't currently have that. There is certainly a case.
No, but you must have some convening power. Like, we've got a strong individual as elected.
Yeah, obviously they do that as a convener.
To clarify, for London, having sat on the Assembly, there's no role for the mayor in that. I think these are some of the things we'd want to discuss in terms of devolution, and I think the jury's still out on ICBs in terms of accountability, transparency. She says from a personal perspective. But I think if we try and just stick within the scope, just mindful of time as well, maybe we can come back to that at the end. I can see quite a lot of members indicating as well.
Yeah, there is a difference with Manchester because obviously we had health devolution previously, and then along came these latest reforms that brought about integrated care systems that literally disconnected, in a sense, that integration agenda that we'd been on for many years prior to the arrival of integrated care systems. So now the combined authority is literally disconnected from all of the activity around the ICB, ultimately, which is accountable to the Secretary of State through NHSE. So, it's a retrenchment of devolution we've seen as a consequence of the advent of integrated care systems in this country, I would say.
I'll just get Chris to finish off the funding question, please.
I don't want to go off scope now, but I suppose I do think it's an important question on this. How can you make that process? I assume your ICB roughly, Paul, crosses over with your local authority area. In which case, how can you make those two things work closer together? Devolution of more powers is part of that, but do you have a sort of vision for how that works better?
So we had a vision, and we were integrated, and we were getting on with the whole agenda around Marmot City region, wider determinants of health and well-being, the integration of local government with CCGs, with our hospital trusts, with our community, voluntary, social, faith and enterprise sector. And, you know, all of that was in place. And then along come the integrated care systems. And literally it's like back to the start, having to come up with another new strategy, having to reset the governance, having to bring in the consultants to advise on what should and shouldn't happen. And literally, we've been taken backwards in Greater Manchester, I would argue. If you have read the Lancet review of devolution and the integration of health with local government, city, regional government, you will see in Greater Manchester there are improvements to life expectancy as a consequence of that integration. But integrated care systems have come along and literally disconnected all of that work and undone some of it and taken us back to basic principles around strategy and policy that we'd already spent years finessing and delivering. And we were wanting to move into that further sort of integration operational space, but weren't seemingly allowed to.
Thank you.
Just to come back on Ben's answer, that was all, on that 200k. You said it would undoubtedly save lives, and I agree. But can you put a figure on how many people will or how many nights accommodation do you think that 200k is going to fund? I'm looking for a bit more of a concrete answer, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose it's difficult to say because some of that accommodation will come at different costs based on some of the needs in our area. For that period, it will probably assist 30 people.
4 months.
For 4 months.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I think you touched on it earlier, but we're going to come back to looking at data. Joe.
Yeah, I guess we've throughout these two sessions heard a lot of the challenges around measuring what's effective, who's affected, and so on. So, do any of you have any ideas around how we could improve the kind of data collection around this topic? Sophie.
Yeah, there's a lot of work happening in this space at the moment, and I think there's a lot of learning coming from that. So we've recently had the new data-led framework, which has been introduced via MHCLG. The women's census has already been mentioned. There's a rural census, there's a young people census, there's the annual rough sleeping count. We also have things like Chain in London. All of these take different approaches and give us different insight. I think there is a need to take a step back and reflect on what the learning from all those different models are and what we could do to roll some of that out nationally without creating a system where all we're doing is gathering data. I think there is definitely gaps in our understanding, particularly when we use data to inform what services need to be delivered, when we know that we are not capturing everybody who is experiencing street homelessness, therefore we're not designing services with them in mind. I think we do really need to look at how we can improve the quality of the data. I think probably there is enough examples of good practice out there that we could take from and learn and sort of build a sort of more effective national model. In Chain we have a lot of understanding about a lot more detail on who is experiencing homelessness than we do in most other parts of the country because of the depth and detail that is enabled. But that requires resourcing, it requires funding, and it requires the kind of investment to be able to deliver the level of outreach needed for that data collection tool. And I think the other thing to be very mindful within this is making sure that data collection then doesn't drive access to support. We've heard earlier around verification, and we do know that there are examples in London where local authorities will say you need to sleep rough and be verified on Chain before we will let you access help. It's another form of gatekeeping. We see that happening across the country. So people are the need for the data capture system becomes a sort of gatekeeping tool to prevent access to services. But there is definitely a huge amount of knowledge out there about what could work, and I think it is just about consolidating the learning to develop a maybe more effective single measure that we can roll out nationally.
And just to link to the previous discussion, final question just for Adam, you mentioned an example where mental health inpatient beds were closed. Do you have evidence that has led to increases in rough sleeping, or and again obviously this whole discussion about how the health service is involved, how could we better link up to inform those health decisions so that they're not inadvertently causing an issue?
So we're clear that it has impacted entrenchment and the length of time people are staying on the streets. I think it's more a case of where it was located meant that we were obviously able to access it to help assist with our street population in around Victoria, and the area is not too far from here. It meant that there was that able to join up with our rough sleeping teams, and obviously we've had to look at other options and invest in our own sort of mental health assistant with the through the voluntary sector and everything else. But it's not the same as having inpatient beds there where you can take people to who are in crisis. So I think it's about making sure that this agenda is picked up by ICBs and other parts of the NHS and mental health teams. So it's not obviously, we have particularly acute issues in Westminster with rough sleeping compared to other local authorities. So and when you're dealing with it on an 8-borough basis, they're not always going to be prioritising that, because understandably they're dealing with all sorts of other mental health crises that they've got elsewhere in the system. We know that we're very clear that it hasn't had an impact on our services. But more broadly, the failures of the underinvestment in mental health services across the country are what is helping drive people onto the streets and making them inherently more resistant to picking up assistance from our outreach teams and everyone else. So I think we need a holistic approach to mental health and linking up with prevention across the country, and then where we've got acute issues of it on the street, it's what more targeted investments can be made to help people who are in crisis on our streets to help get them off, because those are two related but slightly different things.
Can I just say on data, I think this is a fascinating question, because I think some of the solutions are to be found in big data analytics, and I don't just mean looking at it through the lens of service provision, but actually looking at things like Home Office data on accelerated asylum, looking at the government's affordable homes programme in terms of how many social rented properties are we delivering over time, how many local housing allowance properties are we delivering over time, where are those being delivered, how does that marry up with the pressures in terms of homelessness numbers and rough sleeping numbers, what's happening on right to buy in terms of the losses, how are we mapping that data, also what's happening with temporary accommodation numbers within all of the local authorities across the country. In Greater Manchester, 5,649 households are in temporary accommodation, 7,697 of those are children in the temporary accommodation, and 824 are bed and breakfast. We have a lot of data. I don't think the issue is data itself. I think the issue is how we actually marshal the data, how we analyse the data to inform decision making and inform policy. And one of the things I don't think government's ever really grasped is the importance of proportionate universalism. I think all too often we've looked at things through a universal lens and we've assumed a level playing field. Well, there is no level playing field. And if we're serious about tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, we have to get serious about resourcing differently in different parts of the country. So this does have implications for the work that Minister McMahon is doing on local government financing. Proportionate universalism, for me, is definitely the way forward on this agenda.
Thank you very much to our guests. I think you've given us a lot of points for suggestions and questions. I think one thing that's very clear, and which I think Lord Bird was trying to express, was a focus on prevention rather than cure. So it's really important we look at some of the issues and areas that the government can do to prevent that. I think the task force is a good way, but essentially we shouldn't find ourselves having to do that emergency funding every Christmas, because we know that issue is still there and rough sleeping is still persistent. So I think really pushing the government on that is I think there's consensus around that. And I think the other thing as well is looking at this from not just in urban areas, but the figure around 40% increase in rural areas. That should send alarm bells for all of us in terms of this is an issue that's growing right across the country. So I think we'll continue to discuss in this and look at how we can work to essentially make sure we end rough sleeping for good. But thank you very much to our guests for coming this morning. Order, order.